Hey everybody, welcome to Watches with Dennis, and today I want to talk about 5 reasons I think that Rolex is better than Omega. Now, clickbait title, clickbait subject aside, the reason I'm doing this is actually lately, really over the last year, but there have been a lot of YouTube videos talking about why Omega is better than Rolex. And those are fair points to raise. And in fact, I could probably do a 5 reasons that Omega is better than Rolex, but that's not the subject of this video. So just sort of as a counterpoint to all of those commentaries that have come out, really focusing on the superiority of Omega, I thought, even though they don't really need the help, let's go ahead and do one for fun in favor of Rolex. Now, all that being said, just so we're crystal clear, I don't have anything against Omega. I own both Rolex and Omega. I'm not wearing either today. I'm wearing Orient, so that's just the way it's going to be. People sometimes take this a little personally. This is for fun, so let me just emphasize up front. I shouldn't have to do an emphasis, but we could go either way with these. There are points in favor of both brands, but this is just to give us something to talk about. So please do use the discussion section below to comment on, like, do you disagree with some of these 5 points I have, or do you have other points that you think are worth stressing? Point number 1, let's get underway. I want to start with value retention. Now, this one's a little difficult because value retention comes down from really watch to watch and reference to reference, not even just a model line. If we go back in time, a lot of these models from both Rolex and Omega have been around for a number of years, and they've seen updates and they've seen iterations. But broadly speaking, when it comes to value retention, you're going to have more of it with Rolex than you will with Omega. Now, the reason for that comes down to some of the other points, but it's really just about supply and demand. So even though Rolex makes a lot of watches, makes more watches even than Omega does, the fact is they remain highly in demand, and where there is demand, supply meets that need. So Rolex supplies don't really meet all that demand. There often is the ability to sell your watch later on down the line, even if it's an older model, and get more of your money back than you would on an Omega watch. Again, it varies watch to watch, and it's not always going to be necessarily that you will gain a profit even out of a Rolex. Historically, that wasn't the case for many Rolex models. Lately, it's been a little bit different. And if you were to go and look up the brand index values that Watch Charts has at watchcharts.com, currently over the last few months, both of them are showing declines. But the average value of a Rolex watch is higher than the average value of an Omega. That in and of itself isn't the best comparison either, however, because Rolexes sell for more on average than Omegas do new. But when it comes down to what's happened with a watch after you've owned it and worn it for, say, a year, you see less percentage drop on average out of a Rolex than you do an Omega. So that is why it is my number 1 reason for why Rolex is better than Omega. So let's move to number 2. And that really is Rolex just has the more straightforward collections versus Omega. And I think that means a lot in the sense of being able to understand like what you're buying into, or when you're shopping, what you're going to get. It's just more straightforward with Rolex. So Rolex currently has 13 collections. The Air King, the Daytona, the Datejust, the Lady Datejust, the Explorer, the GMT Master 2, the Oyster Perpetual, the Sea Dweller, the Sky Dweller, the Submariner, the Yachtmaster, and the 1908. And within those collections, most of the time we're only talking about different sizing, different case materials, and different dial types. Complications tend to remain fairly consistent. Now, when it comes to differences in complication, we're usually talking about date versus no date, like the Submariner. That's an option within that line. And then the other one that I know jumps out to me is when it comes to the Explorer. So the Explorer and the Explorer 2 is within the Explorer family, even though the Explorer 2 not only adds a date, it also adds a GMT complication. But most of the time, the complications remain pretty static within the Rolex collections. So when it comes to Omega, it starts with 4 families: the Constellation, the Seamaster, the Speedmaster, and the DeVille. Now, going to their website, it seems those families are broken out into various collections. And by my count, the Constellation is 2 collections, the Seamaster is 10 collections, the Speedmaster is 16 collections, and the DeVille line is 5 collections. So that's 33 total collections versus the 13 collections that we have with Rolex. Not only is that 33 collections, when it comes to Omega, the complication differences within the collections are far greater than they are on the Rolex side of things. So as I noted before, Rolex, most of the time, if there's a complication difference at all, it's like date versus no date. But with Omega, there's a lot more variance. Like we've got Aqua Terras, which are in the Seamaster family that are going to be time plus date. And we're going to have others that are going to be world timers. And it's stuff like that. It just gets really complicated. Omega has a lot of SKUs, a lot more SKUs than Rolex does. And the differences within those SKUs is pretty significant. So you have a family and then you have a collection and then there's a lot of variance within that collection. Why is Rolex better for having fewer of these sort of collections? I think it just comes down to being able to understand what you're buying into. Omega is overwhelming and collectors might like that, but I think with the general public, it's a challenge. Jumping to item number 3, which I think is a pretty quick one, service intervals. Now, Rolex and Omega, I believe, both offer 5-year warranties on their watches, so we have parity between the brands there. But in terms of service intervals, Rolex has, currently, modern Rolex, has a 10-year service interval recommendation on their watches. Omega, it varies. It's about 5 to 8 years. So I believe we have an objective superiority on service interval coming out of Rolex. Moving on to number 4 on my list of 5 would be Evergreen Designs. Now, again, this sort of comes down to watch, but Rolex really seems to adhere to a philosophy of trying to stick with evergreen designs. This is something that Tim Massos talked about a lot on the Watchbox's YouTube channel, but I think it's a really good point. And in a nutshell, I would describe it as if you were to take a modern Submariner and you were to show it to someone who has only owned the Submariner that, say, Sean Connery wore as James Bond in the 007 movies, they would recognize that it's the same watch. Not only that it's a Rolex, but that it's a Submariner. And yeah, as collectors, sometimes we get a little frustrated or a lot frustrated with Rolex, and they're very iterative, slow evolutions where they make improvements to the movement and they make adjustments to the case size and they make adjustments to the materials. And maybe they do some different dial colors or bezel inserts. But by and large, the pedigree of the watch lines feels really consistent. An old Explorer and a new Explorer look like an Explorer. And it's the same for the Submariner, the same with the Daytona, and so on and so forth. Omega does this sometimes. Like moon watches look like moon watches when it comes to Speedmasters, but even the Seamaster 300, the 300M is distinguished from the old classic 300 because it looks quite a bit different. Now, maybe the 300M is always going to look like a 300M from this point forward because of the whole Pierce Brosnan and James Bond connection and that thing going on there, but that wasn't historically true for Omega. And there are plenty of watches that come out of Omega that aren't going to look like what they used to look like. And probably moving forward, they're going to look quite a bit different than they used to as well. We don't assume, or at least I don't assume, that the DeVille line is always going to look like how it does now. And so when you go and you say, oh, I have a Seamaster, that doesn't necessarily conjure up a mental image for everyone that's identical. Whereas if you do it with the Submariner, they will. So that's the big difference. That's why Rolex has an evergreen superiority over Omega. The final item in terms of why I think Rolex is better than Omega would have to come down to the prestige and name recognition. And this is not going to be important to everyone, but it is important to a lot of people, especially non-watch collectors. If people go out and say, hey, I've had a lot of success in my career, or I want to celebrate a major milestone, a lot of times they're going to want Rolex because Rolex conveys this prestige, and maybe they can't get it and they get frustrated, but that's a whole other story. And it's just, that's the power of Rolex's marketing. Rolex has that recognition. Rolex has that value. Rolex has that prestige. We as watch collectors know there are plenty of prestigious brands that are far higher up on the hierarchy than Rolex. But when it comes to the everyday consumer, Rolex means a lot. And there are a lot of watch collectors that like to focus on Rolex, perhaps because that's why they got into watch collecting in the first place. And sure, there are a lot of people that will have Omega as their gateway in. They'll have James Bond as the gateway in. They'll have the Moonwatch as the gateway in. Doesn't matter. My point is, though, broadly speaking, the overall prestige advantage goes to Rolex. And it's not really a debated thing. That's why we see all these other videos talking about why Omega is greater than Rolex, because they need those videos. Omega needs it. Omega needs that emphasis. They're still trying to claw a higher market share. And that's fascinating to me that Rolex has such a large market share. Over 25% of the Swiss watch industry in terms of market value on sales is Rolex. And there's still more in demand. Like, you'd think a brand that already has such a big chunk of the market would almost be like a Walmart versus something, more niche like a Trader Joe's. But it's not how it works, at least not with watches. But anyway, those are my 5 reasons why I think Rolex is better than Omega. Again, please share your comments below. It's all for fun. Feel free to share why you think Omega is better. There are plenty of reasons. Obviously, I'm just not going to touch on them in this video because that's not the subject of this video. If you enjoyed the video, please do give it a like, or if you found it interesting, that does help the channel out. If you want to be notified when I have new videos out, just click subscribe. I do have a membership club. It's the 99-cent club because it's 99 cents a month. There's a link in the description if you want to support the channel that way. Feel free to join that. It gets you some of those emojis and their badges, and I don't think there's really anything else, but at 99 cents, hopefully that's enough. And I hope you all have a really good week. I'll talk to you all in the next video. Take care, everybody.